So this video is probably poorly timed if you haven't seen the last one, so I'll explain it here and just completely redo the intro. Basically, this is a state of the game video. This was written like over 2 weeks before they announced the game was going to be dead. So, considering it was basically done, I've decided I'm just going to post it basically as is. It was basically, I literally managed to almost entirely finish it on the Thursday afternoon. They announced the game was going to die. So instead of wasting all of that effort, because this is an hour long, I've decided just to finish it and post it. So basically everything in here is going to be irrelevant within probably a couple of days. However, I hope people enjoy. This was meant to mainly just be a collection of complaints, just so we know what needed fixing, something like that. Something to just talk about, I guess. So, yeah, I hope people enjoy it anyway. I tried to do a bit of voice acting in one of the sections. It was horrific, mainly because it's just meant to be temporary lines, but I'm not re-recording them. So, yeah, get on with it. I'll see you guys around. I'm going to be covering stuff probably throughout June. If anyone's watching, if anyone wants to watch that, comment, sub, whatever, and enjoy.
Oh, do not look at me so.
You're slaves to a tyrant. There's no freedom in that.
This is one battle you cannot fight. Away with you.
We did everything right. Everything that was asked of us, and still it came to this.
Your time has not yet come.
From endless dreams I awake.
calls me to action once more.
Rare to meet someone out here who's not a LARPer himself. What brings you to the complete friends this time of night? Well, if it ain't the oddest joke in the book, mere Unfi, gods rest their soul, used to tell that one to the wretched ones at banning time. And when, pray tell, did we last have a good season? You rotten hate farming, he'd reply. Over 5 bleeding years ago, that's when. You got that look down to a T. I'd almost think you meant it. Got to you, did they? Poor bugger. That explains it then. Well, I've got rage to farm and tweets to make, but you'd best hurry along to the Fred nearby. Just head east through the trees and aim for the Shining Tower. You'll find the Fred soon enough. Tis the most hopeful place for miles around. Go on now, friend. They'll take good care of you in the last scene.
I feel it makes the most sense to talk about the portal first, considering that is what most people say is wrong about the game. I actually like it myself. The idea of an easy-to-access menu that allows you to easily find and access all new and relevant content that will grant you meaningful and relevant rewards, with customizable modifiers that allow you to change how hard you want the experience to be for better rewards, especially with the inclusion of old seasonal content within it, as it would allow you to obtain that old seasonal gear. However, that did not happen. The portal is a failure from a couple fronts. Firstly, it's the removal of the destination screen. I originally thought this was more of an art direction issue where the Hulu style menu I've had it compared to was not as cool as the destination screen. However, it is a lot more than that. Everything in the destination screen was soft sunset with the launch of Edge of Fate, which came with the tiered gear system. Everything in the destination screen was not granted the system, nor any new loots in the activities on this screen. Therefore, everything in the destination screen was now useless in the eyes of the majority who did not care for a random crucible drop by the Devils, or an old Eyes Luna that would be objectively worse than any of the Tier 5 140 due to its lack of the stat bonuses and enhanced perks / origin trait. As such, the destination screen was effectively removed from the game. 90% of the content in the game was then made redundant for the second time in Destiny 2's lifecycle, which had frustrated the average player quite heavily. However, the second issue coming up, that being the content within the portal, I feel enraged players more. The content within the portal is primarily older content, older seasonal content and strikes in particular, most of it being battlegrounds. And the primary new content in there was a bunch of lost sectors called solo ops that were incredibly boring and relied on damage gating and 4-stat encounters in order to make them longer than 3 minutes. They were also originally the only way to efficiently grind power level at a pace that wasn't agonizingly slow, so you imagine everyone was basically fed up with those within a week. Part of this was because the portal was originally advertised as a way to constantly grind power level at your own pace with your friends, but the tiered loot and difficulty system alongside everyone being in a solo-only activity, it in reality ended up being the complete opposite, and Bungie even actually worked against that original idea. The second most efficient way to grind power was doing pinnacle ops that were on launch, exotic missions that you had to run over and over and over and over again, with the best option being the Season of Echoes exotic mission, that could be run with a modifier to grapple through the entire mission, and could actually be run with friends. However, this was nerfed within the first couple weeks, so everyone just went back to solo ops. Later, we saw the addition of onslaughts and dungeon ops, which were specific dungeon encounters you could farm the original gear from. For some reason though, they included the traversal sections, which completely ruined it for most people who were expecting to just play the encounter like an FF14 raid. In Renegades, they also added arenas to the portal. These are the 9-player activities such as Catch Crash, Astral Alignment, and Nightmare Containment, which were nigh unplayable for most of their launch because people would waste all of the revive tokens instantly and fail the activity. So I think me and basically everyone else has only really played them once. Not like I'd ever want to touch Nightmare Containment with a 10-foot pole ever again. The Crucible tab on launch was literally just control and competitive, but did later see rotator modes added to the mix, so I guess that's alright. However, Gambit is just not even in the portal whatsoever, so it's a completely dead playlist since it's in the destination screen. The only actual new content we've had added directly to the portal was an Azure Biome, where we got a couple of new activities, and I genuinely mean it was literally 4 activities were added to the game in the entire update. We had 3 reclaims, which are essentially a copy of the open world activity on the Pale Heart, but on the Plaguelands this time. Except there was no plague, because Siva is dead, that they hammer into you about 50 times whenever you load into one of them. And we also got an exotic mission that was actually semi-nice, but it wasn't really an exotic mission, it was more so just the mission, like the generic activity, which is alright for the portal, but not for the actual exotic mission itself. And I don't really know anyone who actually played them or liked playing them. So, for the past year by now, we've been playing basically only old content, since that is the only thing actually worth playing in the game. And that is the problem. Reusing old content and breathing new life into it is perfectly fine. Actually, I encourage it. But it's the fact that it is the only content in the game. And considering that most of us have already done this content an exceptional amount of times because we had to grind the seasonal gear in these activities, it means everyone's already bored of it. The next issue would be how they've handled any new DLC content. All of it since Edge of Fate has been in the portal. Renegades makes some sense as it's a submenu within a submenu of multiple planets. But even then, you cannot see Kepler at all on the destination screen, nor access any interface content from it. And you cannot see any of the Renegades activity notes from that screen, or any of its content. Bungie seem to have thought that a single, decently sized destination and a raid 90% of the population hasn't done would keep us satisfied for 6 months. And Renegades itself had less content than Edge of Fate did, coming with 3 patrol space-like activities that were pretty good and had a decent amount of ad density and variation to them, but still lacked in replayability after getting everything from them, which happens pretty quickly as they just didn't reset power levels with Renegades. So by I think week 3, I was basically already getting tier 5s, and the only thing that wouldn't drop was the only nothing pulse rifle that I genuinely believe has rarer drop rates than everything else in our pool. I'd also like to mention that the activities themselves were literally just a copy of Helldivers, so they weren't really very original, and felt like I'd already played them anyway because I've played Helldivers before. Didn't do very well though, Bungie. The Portal's UI is also a major problem with it. The point was making it easier to select activities, which it does do, but it still manages to be a mess. For some reason, the ops menus are all vertical and have so much empty space on the screen, meaning you can only actually fit 6 activities on the current setup, which makes it a little harder to find the activity you actually want to play, especially considering there are no search or filter options. Previously, if you wanted to play a specific activity, it was a case of going into the destinations menu, clicking on the planet the activity belonged to, and searching or scrolling through the map screen, sometimes picking a difficulty and then launching in. Now, you open the portal, click on the Ops tab that correlates to the activity you want to play, scroll down the list and likely searching for the activity you actually want to play, as I imagine most people haven't remembered where they are yet, having to choose between doing it solo with custom modifiers or matchmaking it with preset modifiers if it's a featured activity that day, and then finally launching in. This means that despite possibly being quicker for someone who knows what they're doing, it still takes basically the exact same amount of steps for someone to launch in, within more submenus that can allow a new player. And even if a new player wanted to just load into a Strix playlist, it again takes the same amount of steps as it originally would, and doesn't even exist for the Pinnacle Ops playlist, and the matchmaking that does exist for them is incredibly inefficient, and will usually get you unprepared teammates and a modifier preset that is so unfun to play it's not even worth bothering to load it in the first place. You can use the Fireteam Finder, but as I've learned, not everyone wants to stay on the Fireteam Finder or make a post and hope people join before being allowed to play something like you would for a traditional MMO. The weekly reset is also non-existent and poor, being something that was patched in after and isn't very well highlighted. Basically being a couple of playlists in the seasonal hub, a Grandmaster Nightfall that just gives you a Pinnacle Ops truck with an extra origin tray, that nerfs most guns, and highlights the current raid and dungeon. And that's literally it. Other than Eververse, there's basically no more weekly reset and no incentive to log into the game every Tuesday, which is nice for some people, but also terrible for keeping people in the game. So, those I feel are the main issues with the portal itself. Now, modifiers. Modifiers are once again something I actually like, however they do not work in the way they are currently handled. As of right now, whenever you load into a portal activity, in order to get a decent score and actually be rewarded for playing it, you will most likely need to set up your modifiers manually, as there are only a couple activities featured daily, with a matchmaking playlist and preset modifiers. This, I feel, pretty obviously makes 2 problems. You cannot matchmake after setting your own modifiers, so if you wanted to do an arms dealer and it's not a featured activity, you either hope you get it in the one Strikes playlist that exists, or have to Fireteam plan for it, and it's most likely something people are not doing. There is also the situation of wanting to do a featured activity and it happens to have a modifier that ruins your entire build, like Rappler or Match Game. So you have to go back to Fireteam Finder and then hope people in Fireteam find you because they also don't have the modifier set for that day. The other problem is then the availability of modifiers and how the system actually works. Whilst you could technically just play with what is fun, the system actually makes you want to avoid positive modifiers until you get to max power level, and only use the easiest and minimal possible selection of modifiers. This usually involves making the game artificially more difficult and less fun to play. Stuff like removing the UI, knocking away dark selection, adding tanky enemies, timers that make you go to orbit upon expiring, loadout restrictions, and spawning without ammo. I could go on, but these do not make the game actually play harder, but instead add inconsequential debuffs to the player, forcing you to use a fully new loadout that you cannot change or either a timer that will expire or no starting ammo for optimal rewards. It doesn't really do anything when you're actually playing the activity, but it is the only experience worth playing, as adding any more modifiers does not reward the player in any meaningful way. There is never any actual reason to go for anything higher than B rank upon reaching optimum power level, and even below that an A rank usually will grant the optimal rewards for the modifiers needed. So despite having almost every modifier in the game available to us and complete freedom to select things, the current system actually ends up being more limiting than what we had prior, where we just launched into an activity with whatever Bungie preset was already made for us, and then just get to matchmaking. The same thing applies to the feat system for raids and dungeons, although they have a slightly different issue. They are still as limiting, as realistically you should only use as many feats as are required for tier 5 drops. It's primarily the fact that tier 5 drops from raids are locked behind using a certain amount of feats, and not doing so means you're getting gear that is actually worse than what you'd be getting outside of them. All tiered raid and dungeon armor drops are effectively useless unless you can reasonably farm at least, let's say, tier 4 drops of them, so the majority of runs as fireteam finding rad content with feats is a dreadful experience, will be dropping you nothing, and are basically a waste of your time, which is why no one's doing them. And since I've just brought it up, I will go into Roots and Power next. In Azure Phase, Bungie reworked power to be the most important thing to progression in the game, via tying it to the tier system and activity difficulty, whilst also making it abysmal to grind, having I believe a 100-hour grind from 10 to 450 power on launch, if you were being optimal, farming either the Equivalent Pinnacle or Solar every time. It then took them 3 months to fix the power grind when Ash and Iron launched, and it then took a couple weeks, even after that, for them to get where we currently are. The power grind being so easy, it went from 470 to 500 in a week of just playing PvP. With the Renegades launch, they made it even easier, as you basically just get fed 300 power level gear, starting you at tier 3 loot, meaning there are now only 3 tiers of loot despite technically being 5. And making this power grind so easy it's practically not even there, so despite making the game around it and requiring a power grind for there to be enough to do, Bungie have literally just removed it again and cut down the amount of things to do within Destiny by quite the margin. This is a double-edged sword, as making the power grind as relevant as it was pushed away many players, but making it irrelevant in the game's current design also pushed away arguably more players as they ran out of reasons to even play the game at all. As for the actual loot, the way it now works is that there are 5 tiers of loot, with armor getting increased stats and weapons gaining enhanced perks and multiple perks in each column with each tier. Tier 1 and 2 are basically non-existent in the current game and only actually even appear in raids and dungeons due to starting at 300 power level. Tier 3 loot is completely irrelevant the second you start seeing Tier 4s, as the enhanced barrels on weapons make them objectively better stat-wise, and then anything that isn't Tier 5 armor is just completely irrelevant in any unique build crafting, as the ability to shift around 5 whole stat points on each piece of armor, making for a total of 25 stat points, makes builds so much more powerful in the current system, and they drops with a guaranteed 75 stat points, which is the maximum armor can actually roll with. This has been taken by the general community as another attempt to sunset our gear by just power creeping all new gear to be objectively better than any old gear. This was also just taken as a confusing change. You already have a rarity system in the game, that being the common, uncommon, rare, legendary, and exotic system that they could have just used instead of continuing with the current rare, legendary, untiered legendary, tier 1 to 5 legendary, and then exotics that we currently have, with entirely different legendary rarities in the game that work completely differently. And upon hitting maximum power level, we are either showered with loot, or basically get none at all, This means people are only actually doing content that showers them with loot, and makes getting gear incredibly easy and further devalues it. Tier 5s were originally meant to feel special, and now they're basically just handed to you for doing nothing. You can legitimately get 5 drops for completing a single crucible match, and it's a little ridiculous. This makes loot feel unrewarding to obtain and hunt for, so once you get the drop you want, it feels overall just unfulfilling, potentially not even worth all the time it took to actually get to 450 or 500 high level in the first place, so you could farm them. This makes people leave the game, as a reason a majority of people are even playing the game is because they want to farm loot, like in a Borderlands game for example. And is why we also see people wanting for the game to return to what it was even a year ago. As back in Heresy, farming for shiny depth rolls of seasonal loot actually felt somewhat aspirational and like you got something cool for your time. Our current gear is also just ridiculously power-craft, which leads to power creep and balance. I think I've seen gacha games handle this better than Bungie currently do. Bungie have decided in their great wisdom that they want to provide that power fantasy to players. This era of Destiny is fun first. We want players to have a great time and feel overpowered. In a game where we're already overpowered demigods, they decide to then make us legitimately unkillable bioweapons for some reason. It makes a certain type of player happy, but it is just such a bad idea in this game. Currently, we have so much regen and damage resistance that you can basically just stand still, surrounded by hundreds of enemies like in the renegades activities, and feel unkillable. It's basically impossible to actually die in anything that doesn't take you 90 power levels under. And you know, just deals so much damage. The current best weapon in the game is a special ammo rocket firing pulse rifle that deals more damage and DPS than basically every heavy weapon in the game. This is usually combined with Finality's Auger that does respectable damage on its own, and some form of ability spam. Generally, Hellion is the best with a high grenade stat, as the damage from it can also compete with heavy weapons for some reason. On this build, having effectively 3 heavy weapons with nigh unlimited uptime makes everything in the game stupidly easy, even without the fact that you're playing on solo warlock that has so much regen. Damage is basically negligible. Hell, I feel even mid-builds do this now, and to prove it, we'll make something generally garbage and try to run it for a couple of activities that I'll have on screen during this section. In Destiny 1, it was not like this. We actually had the power fantasy and the game managed to still be difficult. It achieved this in a way I believe is similar to what Helldivers 2 does, with temporary power boosts in the form of abilities and power weapons, fighting against enemies that are seen as more powerful than us, pitching the upcoming insurmountable odds parts of a good power fantasy. However, current Destiny 2 is more like Warframe than anything else, with power boosts that are basically active at all times to the point where it's impossible to avoid them, and enemies are mowed through like they basically don't exist. This doesn't work for a game like Destiny, as the story and setting don't really well for it, considering this is meant to be a game set in a post-apocalypse. We are technically blessed by the Traveler at this point, but I don't feel we are meant to just destroy everything in sight. And in gameplay, it just gets completely boring. The enemies are just not made for how powerful we are, and it makes anything at all feel completely meaningless, because if we're capable of doing this, why can't any random Joe Schmuck just get him in retrograde and go do it himself instead of us? And I get some people do really enjoy it being so overpowered, nothing can harm you, but I, and I feel many others, don't, especially those that actually played Destiny 1. Which is why I'm now going to go into specifics as to what is actually overly powercraft. In PvE, the Edge of Fate stat update means that instead of before, where we at least had some downtime due to only being able to actually max out one of the ability stats, due to the changes they made to scaling, everyone has at least all tier 7 to tier 10 cooldowns or better, meaning that without actually build crafting into it, you can easily achieve ability spam to such a level that in most scenarios, primaries become basically useless as you're better off just trying more abilities, since you get them so much, and they will just do more damage than primaries. The new ammo system actually encourages this, as you can basically just guarantee ammo drops now, which was what made double specials so easy to do in the first place back in Nightfall. So now we have everyone just running special weapons, since you can get ammo for them 24/7, and throwing abilities everywhere without investment. Once you do invest into things, that's where it gets truly ridiculous, as for some reason they decided to give us damage boosts for going above 100 stat points into a specific stat, which can give us up to a 65% damage buff for grenades, for example. This adds to the power creep, as we've have basically nothing but buffs since Final Shape launched. Abilities are just too powerful. We've effectively just started playing Warframe and not Destiny at this point, and that is just the easiest way to describe it. A very big example of this is Void Warlock in PvE. With Renegades, they buff scatter grenades and nothing manacles to spawn more scatter grenades which each kill. So now with a high grenade stat, remember it's a 65% damage buff, you can clear entire rooms with a single scatter grenade, whilst getting your health back for every single enemy that was killed, which is a ridiculous amount of power creep, and genuinely just sounds like the average Warframe kit in 2026. When talking about weapons, I have to mention Rocket Pulse Rifles. As I've already said, they do the damage and DPS of heavy weapons and can be combined with heavies you have in your pocket, and turrets that now deal 65% more damage than they used to. However, on other weapons, since we now just have enhanced perks at all times, every perk was effectively buffed, and since most of them are ad clearing perks or damage perks, it's another reason we can just move through ad packs. Rocket sidearms in particular are also good at this, and machine guns are actually pretty decent now due to the aforementioned free heavy weapons we can just carry around. And since the pool's design prioritizes speed, you're punished for trying to use something unique, as you're going to be slower than if you just use the best gear. This means you're basically just always using boring gear that makes the game easy, so you can get gear that you don't want to actually use, because it'll likely be worse than the best gear in the game that is so much better than everything else. It ties back into the feeling that the main chase, the loot part of the looter shooter, is meaningless and unrewarding, on top of the fact we're not even shooting guns anymore in the shooter game. It feels like Bungie wants a fighting game instead, which is now what I'm going to complain about with PvP. This entire section will end up being its own video, so for now I'll attempt to keep it light, because the current state of PvP feels so intentionally made to fuck with long-time fans, especially after the big streak of wins we had from Checkmate to Into the Light, just for it to be thrown out of the window, shut on, set on fire, and buried the second Final Shape launched, in order to what I can only describe as pandering to people who want to be a Cardinal Dive member or play a fighting game instead of the first-person arena shooter they installed the fucking game to play. So let's talk about it. During Into the Light, the sandbox had seen great leaps towards a balance of abilities and weapons, where weapons were finally viable and the primary way of engaging opponents. This was due to how the special armor meter worked and ability cooldowns being increased by 30%, alongside several ability nerfs. The special meter originally was a set amount of weapon kills you had to get in order to fill it. They later made this 6 ability kills and 3 primary kills for a single special break, which on its own forced weapon duels, as in order to get your shotgun that kills at 8 meters away or your fusion rifle with far too much aim assist, you had to actually shoot people. This was healthy for the game, as your FPS arena shooter game was actually a shooter. Then, abilities received nerfs across the board to bring them a little closer in line, although some were still too far out of line, like Void Invis or Arc Warlock. The ability cooldown increased further this focus on weapons and shooting your guns, while still letting abilities be a little fun. So, instead of continuing this trend of making abilities actually semi-balanced within the sandbox and making weapons your primary way of engaging opponents, why did we decide to then completely shift what the dedicated PvP player base loved into a fighting game 3 months after making something almost everyone actually enjoyed? In Final Shape, Bungie released Prismatic, bringing, yet again, another ability spam meta. Due to how broken all of the Prismatic subclasses were on launch, especially Titan and Hunter, Titan could spam Diamond Lances and Radiant off of just basic melees, with some using Hammer Strike, Diamond Lance with Peregrines instead, and still are. Hunter had Invis Warhacks, buffed Smoke Bombs that were now just a second grenade that also blinded and slowed. Swarm Grenades that were indestructible, dealt most of your HP and it's scorched on, I think, a 2-minute base cooldown that could be heavily decreased. And Strength Cleanse that constantly pinged your radar and also acted like barricades but on Hunter. Warlock had a decent share of cheese with the turret builds and triple hawks like melees that can still one-shot players. However, it honestly wasn't anywhere near as bad as the other two. The special ammo system was then basically reverted and made much worse because you now had one ammo brick on any kill, plus ammo bricks on walls around the map. And then instead of at least pulling away from the pulse rifle meta that was still a bit of an issue during Into the Light, they doubled down. I believe for Final Shape launch it was a continuation of Elsie's rifle with the addition of Red Death and Gavostov that on launch had a better tactical than any water rifle in the game, and spread large parts of its damage to other teammates, which both punished peeking or aggressive play. That then went on to Revenant, which then tuned down Prismatic a bit, but shoved Bygones into the middle, so we were basically playing the same game we were mid-Final Shape. Except, again, worse, because instead of having to deal with a free 40s time to kill 2 busting us, we now had an even easier free 90 pulse rifle 2 busting us faster than the other one. Specials were then made even more broken due to 2 new perks being Lone Wolf and Closing Time. Both granted passive aim assist buffs, one scaling on other players and the other scaling on ammo. Lone Wolf granted extra AE, so shotguns could actually shoot in the air, and Closing Time granted extra range and handling. These perks both massively buffed special weapons, and I'm still amazed these perks are actually in the game as they currently are. Since these 2 perks basically outdid any nerf special weapons had previously gotten to them within the last few years by literally just hard buffing the stats that were originally nerfed. The amount of ammo you could obtain in the Final Shape era also boosted this, as any OK player could run around with an excess of ammunition and spam their newly re-overpowered special weapons. Rapid fire fusions and slugs are a particular issue during this time, but still play PvP to this day, even after Closing Time in particular was nerfed mid-season, but that basically made no difference. I believe in Heresy, Prismatic was finally put into a balanced state so that most of its bullshit was removed with that update. However, they then buffed Radiant Death Machines so they were now the primary and hipfire of this exotic, which was pretty nice, but they also buffed 450 pulse rifles into being the best pulse rifle type, or substantially nothing free volley range. They then released Redrick's Esther, another pulse rifle that can 2 burst faster than the last one, and is even easier to use than Bygones with more range, more stats, and is buffed heavily by RDMs as it's a hipfire exotic, meaning it can basically just be used at any range because, of course, they'd just make one primary better than everything else ever. Void Hunter was then made even more powerful than it already was after the prismatic nerfs with On the Prowl, as it enabled more ability spam so you could throw even more smoke bombs that were yet to be properly nerfed. As with On the Prowl, it would mark targets wherever you went in this. Obviously, on launch, this was a war hack, as with all abilities on launch, and gave you, I believe, 20% ability energy per kill. Due to RDMs also giving you extra dodge charges, you could essentially just have invis 100% of the time, meaning On the Prowl was active basically 100% of the time. So you always had a war hack on someone, got 20% of all ability energy back for killing them, and also got a stability and reload increase that stacked with each kill. Oh, and you also got a second free smoke bomb out of it because it made a smoke bomb on their body. This meant that the Void Hunter was undeniably the best subclass in the game, once again, with Void Warlock not far behind. There's then Arc Titan that gained a new barricade ability alongside Bolt Charge being added to Arc. Bolt Charge is essentially ignition for Arc and gives 2.5% melee energy per stack to 25%. This charge is first gained via doing a multitude of things on Arc, and then basically just dealing damage. The Titan Barricade ability then just gives you charges for standing near it, and boosts progression from weapon damage. This meant in PvP for a short period of time we had yet another sit behind the barricade meta that was, thankfully, quickly dealt with. but Board Charge itself is still an issue due to the melee energy it provides, since it furthers melee spam, on top of the damage it deals, which is about 66 in PvP. So it can remove half a burst from a pulse rifle, and considering it's a meta based on shooting people from across the map, that isn't exactly the best idea when thinking of new things to add. Therefore, this final ship era, especially Heresy, ended up being mainly unliked, with pulse rifles, special weapon spam, and Invis Hunter being the meta for all 3 months. Therefore, when Edge of Fate launched, obviously they did absolutely nothing that was already an issue and actually just made it worse. As mentioned previously, the Edge of Fate stat change gave everyone Tier 7 to Tier 10 cooldowns for basically nothing. It was literally as simple as getting 50 to 70 stat points in every stat. That was incredibly easy to do with the new stat system. They did, however, make regen slower so you can't run out as quickly, which slowed the game down, as even with 150 health stat up, you still regenerated slower. The damage bonuses for some reason also affected PvP. So on launch we had the weapon stat that granted a 10% damage buff, which allowed several weapons to break through certain time to kill rules. This included our next pulse rifle meta, as whilst Redrix was nerfed to no longer 2 burst, they then made last Thursday, another 390 pulse rifle that had element to honing, which was a 30-second long 10% damage bonus for dealing damage with 2 different elements. On launch with the weapon stat, I don't think you even needed to hit people with 2 elements, it genuinely just did it from neutral. So, that's fun, and there were a number of other weapons that did things like this, like Precision Instrument 190 handguns. The melee stats damage buff is another problematic enhanced stat. It started with Arc Hunter, as Arc Hunter was buffed across the board with Edge of Fate's launch, with lots of smaller changes. Melee abilities now scaled with Combination Blow and activated. So, whenever you get a Tempest Strike kill, you now also roll back and a damage buff for it. Tempest Strike also scaled with the melee stats so you could one-shot people using it, and we then later found out that using Combination Blow and Tempest Strike would just let you one-shot on its own, especially with Spark of Feedback or Bob Charge. So, it basically evolved into a over-tuned mess that was reliant on just getting Tempest Strike kills. Technically, it was a counter to Void Hunter, but as an overall game thing, it just didn't fit and made playing matches miserable. Gambler's Dodge was also for some reason changed to grant melee energy whenever you use it, at the cost of being based on the melee stat, which didn't work since the melee stat was incredibly easy to get, as you either have to get melee stat, class stat if you wanted a high health stat, which was the number 1 most needed stat. A slightly lesser used thing was also Flux Grenades, which were buffed to have significantly better tracking and a lower cooldown. So due to everyone having tier 10 cooldowns and people making discoveries in fragments, this was primarily Spark of Recharge, as it gave you basically a quarter of a grenade back whenever you have low health, due to the 200% additional recharge rate buff it grants. These compounding changes changed Arc Hunter from the movement subclass to a class that relied on getting a Tempest Strike kill or several one-shots, which again, just like it doesn't fit Arc Hunter whatsoever. There are then Glaives, which are the biggest problem child of this stat. With 200 melee stat and any other damage buff, these things turn into 2-tap and even 1-tap monsters. The biggest evils that make the just push W and melee playstyle possible is Banner of War with Feedback Fence and Weewarp with Winter's Guile. The easiest solution to this, generally insufferable playstyle, would be just removing the damage bonus, but since that's apparently not possible, they basically exist as a way for bad players to obtain cheap kills on unsuspecting players or those who try to play close range or aggressive. The same can be said for people with high melee stats and insurmountable Skullfields. Moving away from stats to general builds, Void Hunter wasn't changed and if anything just benefited from Edge of Fate, as the cooldown reductions just meant even more smoke bombs, until they were eventually nerfed later on. However, on launch it was even more miserable than it was previously. And speaking of miserable,
Void Warlock started to cement itself as broken instead of incredibly good and easy to use. Void Warlock has always been incredibly effective as well as being easy to use due to the Void Soul, Blink, and Void's generally good nature in PvP. In Edge of Fate and Renegades though, it got a couple changes. Renegades suppress grenades were made to no longer suppress, a very minor change, but a lot of Void Warlocks who generally don't have movement outside of blinking to throw a grenade at their feet in a pinch. Pocket Singularity was given 2 charges and a damage buff with far more range. Like, these things generally compare with throwing knives and they actually just track into you. I don't know what they were thinking with those. Void Soul was buffed by the recovery nerf happening, so the tick damage it did was even more impactful than it already was, as you could delay regen for even longer. And you can also move whilst casting Rift now, so it's even easier to get off in tougher fights. And if you are using Scar Grenades, since the charged up version now tracks, it made them even easier to get a lot of damage off of. These couple of changes add on a lot to the subclass, considering the class already had Devour and any ability kill, a 20 meter radius tick damage, life/ability steal and weaken from Void Soul, Blink and 100 AE, and 3 supers that were already amazing, but got buffed further, with Vortex Nova pulling more and multiple times, and Nova Walk making Scar Grenades on Blink and pulling into its Charge Blast. A fighting game comparison then comes in the form of Bungie's obsession with counters, and how they expect you to counter these things at all times in any match. Void Warlocks are countered with positioning, high damage and suppression effects like Suppression, Suspend and Freeze, alongside any hard rushdown that a Warlock cannot escape from. Arc Hunter is countered by being a long range, suppression effects, slows and Void Hunter. Glaives are countered by being specifically just out of their range and slows, with Walk is countered by slows and suppression, Void Hunter is countered by good positioning, Void Warlock as a whole, and Arc Hunter as a whole. It even extends to weapons somewhat, with pulses being countered by peak shooting with a 120 from an even further range, 140 handguns are countered by pulse rifles and anything with a quick time to kill, 120s die when an SMG pushes directly into them, fighting a final warning requires good positioning, and since most of them just use the aimball mode you can deny them getting the lock on, and then spread shot handguns can be countered with shotguns reliably and backing up. These sound simple, but a lot of these being used at once will basically require you to play the match entirely differently depending on your opponent, which feels far more similar to a fighting game in practice than a first-person shooter. Even Overwatch, which is always constant counterpicks, doesn't feel like it's forcing you to play completely differently this much. As I said, I want this to be its own separate video, so I won't go on a deep dive, as otherwise we'll be here too long. However, I hope this gets at least some of the point across. Let's separate this up, some smaller issues, starting with strikes. We've gotten 0 new strikes since Final Shape launched, and the last strike as a whole was Season of Heresy. You could technically call the couple of missions strikes due to how they're designed, but they just don't do it. And for PvE players, not having a new easily completable activity is like not having any new PvP maps, which we have this on, and it seems like they will never get any new ones at the current rate. You can't inspect perks, unlike Destiny Rising. In fact, we are 12 years into this franchise and I still cannot look at a tutorial Gaze's perk pool in game, but I can in the Destiny 2 gacha. It is crazy to me. We're relying on third-party sites and the best one doesn't even work currently. These sites, unlike Destiny 2, will actually show us exact numbers and how exactly perks will affect our guns in-game. But this is in Destiny Rising once again, where we get to see the exact 36% damage bonus of most perks in that game. But we can't in D2. I can understand they don't want to overwhelm players, but it is as simple as making it a toggle. Then there is all the ritual and wardrobe weapons that have been unsunset but are entirely unavailable. I know for a fact Bungie wants to use them as drip feed old content, with the excuse of new perk pools, but there is literally 0 reason as to why we cannot have weapons like Entire PD, Dustrock Blues, Aaron Till, Duke Mark 44, or even the Black Armory weapons in the Banshee weapon pool. And even less reason as to why we cannot pull Patron of Lost Causes or Spare Rations from Drifter, Service Revolver and Main Ingredient from Zavala, or Hard Truths and Gentleman's Vagabond. from shacks. People would love Bungie if they added a bunch of these ritual weapons to literally any vendor pool in the game, entirely unupdated, since they can go and regrind these weapons whenever they want to. Silververse as a whole isn't too bad right now, but it's very clear with how much content it's getting every update that Bungie wants to get as much money as possible with the cosmetics. The ore is only being available through silver purchases, new shaders only being available through silver for the first 6 months. Most of the core sets being locked to Eververse, including an Iron Banner armor set they were about to put in there, constant new collabs, and hell, even the entire Star Wars DLC, which is just an excuse to sell more Eververse cosmetics. And have you seen how many they've added? There is literally an entire tab that has existed since launch just for Star Wars cosmetics. Solo instance patrol spaces make the game feel lonely alongside the plethora of activities that make solo play optimal. Final Shape's era was plagued with constant game-breaking bugs, such as the Icebreaker quest not functioning correctly for most of the season. Now it's merely minor, but impactful things that don't get fixed for months, such as the drop rates being fucked for Regus Pledge for the entire week Iron Banner was back, or triple laureates being disabled in PvE from Guardian Games launch to 2 weeks ago. You cannot get Tier 5 exotics, something Bungie have promised us is coming out, but is a double-edged sword. On one hand, the Tier 5 exotics will have the best possible builds and stats, but on the other hand, Tier 5 exotics will have the best possible builds and stats. Negative. Simply speaking, Tier 5 exotics will make us more overpowered, and is something we don't really need. On top of this, all current exotics are likely to be made redundant, as why would anyone ever bother using an exotic armor piece with worse stats, so people will have to farm exotics again, and will likely have to completely redo their builds, which will be annoying because of Bungie's continued vaulting of previous season gear. 2 big examples of this in my eyes is Min Retrograde, as it's only currently obtainable from potentially being in Solar's inventory, and all old armor being entirely unobtainable, such as the Bushido set. Then, there's all of the event stuff that's only ever obtainable during the event, like the Iron Panoply set that I had to wait 5 months for another chance of getting the god rolls I wanted, which wouldn't have even been obtainable in the first place if we didn't have the delay, because of Bungie's continued vaulting of gear. In Renegades, we were given a pretty sizable increase to 1,000 slots, but with the updates to armor, the fact that weapons are random rolls and Bungie keeps removing loot sources, 1,000 vault spots is simply not enough. Nearly half of my entire inventory, including 2 full postmasters at current, is just armor, with 532 slots of it being armor and 633 being weapons. Admittedly, I haven't cleared it since Renegade's launch, but if the game is going to last another year like that 4 DLC announcement tweet said it should, and with gear vaulting at the rate it's currently happening, will eventually fill even with constant pruning. Like with PvP, I could legitimately go on for hours about these many small issues, such as Final Warning and Osteostraker being in the game. However, since I don't want to be talking for several hours, I will conclude that there are far too many smaller issues in the game, and apart from major things like the portal or sandbox balance, these majorly impact people's enjoyment of the game, and it is impossible to play even a single small session without running into one of them. And Destiny's seeming reluctance to properly address these is a huge contributor to the game's current state, which is one of the main points I want to drive home with this. As whilst people may immediately go to the pool or sunsetting or balance as overall issues as to where the game is failing, it's the compilation of smaller issues within them that really make up the problem, and is something I worry the community has failed to communicate with Bungie, which both are massive problems, and I will quickly go over them. Firstly, the community. Some of you are genuinely just stupid. For example, the amount of people I've seen say they need to stop all development on Marathon and put all resources on Destiny 3, or the opposite, need to genuinely stop talking. If you want Bungie to die, go ahead and keep telling them that, because that's basically what you're asking of them. Bungie needs both games in order to survive, and if you do not know the frankly simple business knowledge to get this point, just shut up. For someone who does need to talk, as of the 19th of May 2026, the day I am writing this, Bungie have not released any details of this mythical June 9th update, outside of potentially getting Gambit weapons, and that we're getting a full suite of tiered and re-pulled raid and dungeon gear on launch. We basically know nothing, and we were promised that we'd receive details not only on this mythical June 9th update that would allegedly save the game, but also a roadmap on the future of Destiny as a franchise around the middle of May. Now, the issue is, it is currently the 19th, and that is far more than the middle of May, and there are 3 twabs left before we get the mythical June 9th update. So, I am pleading at this point for where this information actually is, because for all I know, it doesn't exist, and we don't know if it does. Nor do we have any idea what the future of Destiny even will be. It's likely they continue it, as they need to live as a company, but what does that actually entail? Do they finish D2 next year and move straight to D3, or do we keep getting DLCs for D2? Does D2 get a complete overhaul, run with 1 style, or I don't know, they release only less cosmetics for the next several years. It could really be anything at this point. The last thing worth covering at this point, I feel, is the story. I was originally going to give it a massive section like how it was in the original State of D2 video I made. However, I feel that's a poor choice, as I only really need to talk about renegades. Ejifei itself was actually pretty decent for a Destiny story. Maya is still an incredibly underwhelming and uninteresting villain as she's been since Echoes, but Lidai was actually very well written and actually felt natural in the game despite Bungie's attempts at Shima. I also feel as an introduction to the Night Plot it did its job and is a decent onboarding point for newer players, as it does explain a lot of details that new players would need to understand. Renegades is not so good, as it is basically just Star Wars reference material, the DLC, and it wears it on its sleeves. From the obvious ties to Kylo Ren and the Death Star parallels, to Drifter getting carbonized and the complete shift and rewrite of the Praxic Order and Dredgens into being Jedi and Sith at an exact level, including the Praxic Order suddenly having temporals that use pyramid tech just so they're able to reference kyber crystals and Jedi temples, because of course they would, as well as completely redesigning our lore, despite giving an exact description of her in a previous lorebook. So thanks Renegades for just making the story far more convoluted for no reason. And I think that is basically everything important when it comes to the state of Destiny 2. I don't really feel it's worth going over any fixes to these problems, as people have already tried to do that themselves enough, but I wanted to highlight the current issues and what is bad about the game, so we know what needs changing when Bungie actually gives us any amount of detail. I hope this video achieves that, and if you enjoyed, feel free to like, comment, sub, whatever, and yeah. Bye.